Water has always been seen as a simple necessity, something we turn on at the tap without a second thought. But what if I told you it's quickly becoming the most valuable resource on Earth, one that could spark the next great conflict between nations? For generations, oil was the fuel that shaped wars, alliances, and global power. Today, the same is true for water. And now, as droughts intensify across the American West, a bold new demand from Washington has placed Canada's rivers and lakes at the center of a dispute that could redefine North America's future. The question is simple. Could water push Canada and the U.S. into their biggest clash in decades? It all started with tariffs, steel, and cargo ships, not rivers and reservoirs. When Donald Trump launched his aggressive trade war, his target was foreign competition, and his weapon of choice was tariffs. At first, the fight played out on the docks. Container ships that once poured into American ports slowed to a crawl, bookings collapsing by nearly half in just a year. The mighty port of Los Angeles, the busiest on the continent, saw its traffic cut dramatically, while other American hubs faced the same fate. Warehouses emptied, workers were sent home, and business owners braced for a storm they could not control. What was meant to be a show of strength against rivals quickly turned into a strain on America's own supply chains. But the economic pain didn't end with shipping. Farmers who had relied on exports to Asia watched their crops rot in silos. Manufacturers struggled to get critical parts, halting production lines in industries that had once powered America's growth. Truckers, dock workers, and small-town businesses across the heartland felt the pinch as trade dried up. Tariffs, instead of shielding the country, had triggered a chain reaction that spread from coast to coast. The cracks in America's economic armor were showing, and Washington knew something had to change. That's when the conversation shifted. Instead of talking about shipping containers or tariffs on steel, the White House began focusing on something far more essential: survival resources. Water, once an afterthought in political speeches, suddenly became the centerpiece of strategy meetings. Drought across the American West was tightening its grip, draining reservoirs, scorching farmland, and leaving millions of people wondering how long their taps would still run. The question wasn't about shipping costs anymore. It was about whether America had enough water to sustain its agriculture, industries, and cities. Trump's message grew sharper with each passing week. Ports, he argued, could recover. Tariffs could be renegotiated. But without water, there was no future. And just north of the border, Canada possessed some of the largest reserves of fresh water on Earth, rivers that surged through mountains, lakes that stretched farther than the eye could see, and aquifers deep enough to supply generations. To Trump, this wasn't just a neighbor's natural wealth, it was a lifeline. So the trade war, already bruising and divisive, began to morph into something bigger. It was no longer just about tariffs, lumber, or autos. It was about survival itself. And as Washington set its sights on Canada's rivers, a new kind of conflict was born, one that promised to be fiercer, more personal, and far harder to resolve. The turning point came when Donald Trump took the stage in Washington and made one of his most audacious declarations yet. Canada's rivers, he said, were the key to America's survival. For decades, water had been quietly managed through treaties, agreements, and cross-border cooperation, rarely stirring headlines. But in Trump's words, those rivers transformed overnight, from shared lifelines into bargaining chips. The boldness of his claim shocked observers across the continent. He painted Canada's vast network of freshwater systems, stretching from the Great Lakes to the roaring rivers of British Columbia, as untapped reserves waiting to be harnessed for America's drought-stricken fields and industries. In his telling, it wasn't a matter of partnership, it was a matter of necessity. At the center of the storm stood the Columbia River Treaty, a pact signed in 1961 that had long been celebrated as a model of international cooperation. For decades, the treaty balanced two nations' interests. Canada built dams and reservoirs that prevented devastating floods downstream in the United States, while also generating clean hydroelectric power for its own citizens. In return, America shared the benefits of stability, energy, and carefully managed flows. It was proof that even in an era of fierce rivalries, nations could find common ground in the management of nature's most vital resource. But that spirit of partnership ended the moment Trump spoke. Instead of negotiating a renewal of the treaty, his administration abruptly pressed pause. What had once been a symbol of shared stewardship became a pawn in a larger struggle for leverage. The message was unmistakable. Water would no longer be treated as a mutual responsibility, but as a tool of power, something the United States could demand when its survival was at stake. In Ottawa, the shock was immediate. Canadian officials had entered treaty talks expecting routine updates, adjustments for modern energy demands, and flood control strategies. Instead, they found themselves blindsided by a declaration that upended 6 decades of trust. What had been predictable and cooperative was suddenly volatile and adversarial. Trump's words signaled not just a shift in policy, but a rewriting of the rules themselves. By redefining water as a bargaining chip, the U.S. president set the stage for a conflict unlike any tariff dispute or trade squabble. Oil, steel, and lumber could be negotiated, taxed, or embargoed, but water was different. It was life itself, the foundation of food, industry, and energy. And now, for the first time in modern history, the most powerful nation in the world was demanding access to its neighbor's supply, not as a partner, but as a claimant. The reaction in Ottawa was nothing short of explosive. Within hours of Trump's declaration, Canadian leaders, Indigenous communities, and environmental groups were united in outrage. What Washington framed as a matter of survival was seen in Canada as nothing less than an assault on sovereignty. Politicians across party lines denounced the idea of exporting rivers as if they were commodities, while advocacy groups mobilized to make sure the message was heard loud and clear. Canada's freshwater was not up for negotiation. For Indigenous nations whose ancestral lands are deeply tied to rivers and lakes, the issue carried even greater weight. Water, they argued, was not just a resource, it was life, culture, and identity. Handing it over to a foreign government would be an act of betrayal on a generational scale. At the center of this storm stood Prime Minister Mark Carney, a man whose rise to power had surprised many. Known internationally for his work in banking halls and financial institutions, Carney had built his reputation as a technocrat, someone more comfortable with balance sheets than fiery speeches. But Trump's demand forced him into an entirely new role. For the first time, Carney had to shed the quiet, cautious demeanor of a banker and step into the posture of a national defender. The transformation was startling. With firm words and a rare edge in his voice, he declared that Canada's rivers and lakes were not for sale, not today, not ever. His message carried a finality that no one in Washington could misinterpret. That declaration sent ripples far beyond Parliament Hill. Over 80 coalitions, ranging from Indigenous councils to environmental watchdogs, issued statements of support. Protests were organized in major cities, where thousands of Canadians carried signs declaring, "Hands off our water." Commentators on television spoke of a rare moment of national unity, where political divides seemed to vanish in the face of a common threat. Even in rural towns far removed from international politics, the sentiment was the same. Water was the line in the sand, and Canada would not be pushed across it. The defiance stunned Washington. For decades, American leaders had quietly assumed that in times of crisis, Canada would provide, whether it was lumber, oil, or hydroelectric power. But Carney's hard stance shattered that assumption. What had been routine cooperation was now an international confrontation. Canada, long perceived as the junior partner in North American politics, was suddenly standing eye to eye with its powerful neighbor and refusing to blink. For Canadians, it was more than politics. It was a moment of sovereignty reclaimed. While Ottawa celebrated its firm stand, the fallout south of the border was immediate and devastating. No group felt the blow harder than America's farmers. In California's Central Valley, the agricultural heart of the nation, growers had been told to expect relief. Washington's promises of diverted Canadian water painted a picture of salvation: fields saved, harvests secured, livelihoods protected. But when Canada slammed the door shut, those promises evaporated. Irrigation canals that farmers had counted on ran empty, and allocations that were supposed to arrive never came. The land that produced much of America's fresh produce was left to bake under an unforgiving sun. The scale of the crisis was staggering. The Central Valley alone is responsible for nearly 40% of the vegetables Americans eat and two-thirds of the nation's fruits and nuts. Almond orchards, tomato fields, and lettuce crops, once green and thriving, withered in the heat. Farmers walked through rows of shriveled plants, knowing that every acre lost meant not just a bad season, but financial ruin. Decades-old family businesses that had fed the nation for generations suddenly faced bankruptcy. With no water, there was no way to recover. But the pain didn't stay on the farms. It rippled outward into every household. Supermarkets that once overflowed with affordable produce began posting higher and higher prices. Tomatoes doubled in cost, almonds and walnuts shot up in price, and lettuce became a luxury item for families already struggling with inflation. Shoppers who once filled their carts without a second thought now found themselves making difficult choices at the checkout line. The reality was clear. Canada's refusal had jumped from political speeches in Ottawa straight to dinner tables across America. Anger began to swell. Farmers held rallies demanding that Washington deliver on its promises. Local news channels broadcast images of dry fields and frustrated workers, sparking outrage among viewers who couldn't understand how a political standoff thousands of miles away had left their grocery bills spiraling. Some accused Canada of holding food hostage, while others blamed Trump's administration for overpromising what it could never deliver. In either case, the trust between Washington and America's agricultural backbone was beginning to crack. For generations, California's farmland had been a symbol of abundance, feeding not only the U.S. but much of the world. Now, it stood as a symbol of fragility. Without water, the land could not produce, and without that production, the entire country would feel the sting. What began as a dispute over sovereignty had quickly transformed into a food crisis that threatened the stability of everyday life. The agricultural collapse was only the first shockwave. Next came the industries that formed the backbone of America's economy, and their dependence on water proved even more staggering. In Arizona, the booming semiconductor sector was already stretched thin by drought. Chip fabrication plants, some of the most advanced in the world, require tens of millions of gallons of ultra-pure water every week to keep their production lines running. These facilities had counted on Trump's promises of Canadian supply as a way to stabilize their operations and meet soaring global demand. But when Canada refused, those carefully laid plans crumbled. Executives warned of delays, shortages, and lost contracts, while the global tech market braced for yet another supply chain shock. The Midwest faced its own reckoning. States like Ohio, Michigan, and Wisconsin, where Trump had promised a manufacturing revival, suddenly saw steel mills and auto plants falter. These industries are water-intensive, relying on steady flows to cool machinery, refine metals, and assemble vehicles. Without the extra supply they had been banking on, production slowed, shifts were cut, workers sent home, and uncertainty spread through communities that had only just begun to believe in the return of industrial strength. In places where factories weren't just workplaces but lifelines for entire towns, the mood turned bleak. And then came the energy crisis. Hydroelectric dams across the Pacific Northwest had already been weakened by years of low reservoirs. Industry leaders hoped Canadian reserves could fill the gap, keeping turbines spinning and lights on. But Canada's refusal left utilities scrambling. With reservoirs dropping too low to generate sufficient power, operators had little choice but to fall back on coal and natural gas. Plants that had been mothballed in the push toward clean energy roared back to life, spewing emissions and driving costs higher. Consumers who had expected stable, renewable electricity suddenly faced surging bills and rolling warnings about grid reliability. The ripple effects compounded quickly. Tech firms feared shortages of critical chips, car dealers braced for tighter inventories, and energy providers issued gloomy forecasts. What was supposed to be a new era of self-reliance and industrial resurgence looked instead like a return to scarcity, instability, and frustration. The industries that had once symbolized American progress, chips, cars, steel, and clean energy, were now on the front lines of a crisis rooted in a neighbor's refusal. For the average worker or household, the details hardly mattered. All they saw were higher bills, fewer jobs, and a growing sense that promises made in Washington were unraveling before their eyes. The political fallout was swift and brutal. Trump had built his image on projecting strength, promising to put America first and never back down from a fight. But Canada's outright defiance exposed cracks in that narrative. To many Americans, it was a stunning reversal. The world's most powerful country being stonewalled by a smaller neighbor that simply said no. For critics, it was proof that Trump's bold declarations were more bluster than leverage. For his supporters, it was a painful reminder that even the strongest rhetoric couldn't conjure water out of thin air. The spectacle of America being denied by Canada, long viewed as a quiet partner, was a humiliation that Washington couldn't spin away. As if that weren't enough, Trump's rhetoric soon extended beyond rivers to the Great Lakes, one of the most vital freshwater systems on Earth. For decades, the Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement had stood as a cornerstone of cross-border cooperation, safeguarding drinking water for nearly 40 million people in cities like Chicago, Detroit, and Cleveland. But when Trump hinted that even this agreement might be re-examined, alarm bells rang across the Midwest. Local leaders warned of chaos if protections were weakened, with drinking supplies, shipping routes, and entire regional economies hanging in the balance. The thought of turning the lakes themselves into bargaining chips rattled communities that had always trusted in their permanence. Suddenly, the security of a resource millions relied on every day felt uncertain. Markets reacted in kind. Investors, already spooked by shortages in agriculture and delays in industry, began recalculating risk around water-intensive sectors. Agricultural stocks dipped as supply chain disruptions grew clearer. Semiconductor companies saw volatility, with analysts warning that water shortages could cripple production just as demand soared. Energy providers reliant on hydropower faced downgrades, and utilities burning coal and gas were flagged for higher long-term costs. What began as a diplomatic standoff between two governments now rippled into Wall Street portfolios and consumer confidence. For ordinary Americans, the backlash was felt in three ways: rising grocery bills, higher utility costs, and growing anxiety over whether factories could stay open. Anger built as the public watched the administration's promises unravel in real time. In town halls and television interviews, farmers, factory workers, and families vented frustration. Some blamed Canada for withholding resources, but many more blamed Trump for overreaching and under-delivering. What was meant to be a show of dominance instead left Washington weakened, markets shaken, and everyday people paying the price. The political gamble had backfired, and the cracks in Trump's strength narrative were now impossible to ignore. What began as a North American dispute quickly spilled onto the world stage. Across the globe, governments and analysts drew immediate parallels between Trump's confrontation with Canada and the water battles already reshaping other regions. In the Middle East, rivers like the Euphrates and the Jordan have long been flashpoints, fueling tensions between upstream and downstream nations desperate for control. In Asia, the Mekong and Brahmaputra rivers divide powerful states from their vulnerable neighbors, with dams and diversions sparking diplomatic standoffs year after year. To many observers, Washington's demand for Canadian water was just the latest chapter in a growing global pattern. Where water flows, power follows. China, always quick to spot opportunity, began moving quietly in the background. State-backed companies and investors probed Canada's water sector, floating offers of infrastructure partnerships and long-term cooperation deals. On paper, these proposals looked like development projects, new pipelines, purification systems, and storage facilities, but critics warned they were Trojan horses, designed to secure Beijing access to the one resource its sprawling cities and thirsty industries could not do without. For China, water wasn't just a commodity, it was the foundation of survival. As domestic rivers ran dry and aquifers collapsed under overuse, Canadian freshwater looked less like an investment and more like insurance for the future. Europe, too, began recalibrating its strategy. Southern nations like Spain, Italy, and Greece had endured relentless droughts, watching their farmlands turn brittle under scorching summers. For them, Canadian freshwater wasn't just attractive, it was a potential lifeline. Policymakers in Brussels quietly added Canada to their long-term resource planning, envisioning trade agreements and partnerships that could one day funnel water, or at least Canadian agricultural exports, into European markets. What once sounded like distant speculation was now being treated as a realistic scenario. Canada, long seen as a secondary player in global politics, was suddenly being cast as a central gatekeeper of survival. The world was watching closely, and the message was impossible to ignore. Water had become the new oil. Just as OPEC had once dictated the flow of energy and reshaped alliances overnight, Canada now found itself holding a resource capable of shifting global power. To allies, that made Ottawa a partner too important to overlook. To rivals, it made Canada a target of interest, maybe even pressure. Either way, the conflict with Washington had elevated Canadian water from a regional asset into a global bargaining chip. And in the background, a larger question loomed. If nations were already positioning themselves for access, how long before water wars became the defining struggle of the 21st century? History has a way of repeating itself, and for many observers, Canada's defiance carried an unmistakable echo of the 1970s oil crisis. Back then, few believed petroleum could be wielded as a geopolitical weapon. Oil was simply a commodity, traded like any other, until OPEC's sudden embargo upended that assumption. Overnight, nations that had once felt secure found themselves scrambling for fuel, economies teetered on collapse, and global alliances were redrawn in the face of scarcity. That moment changed the world's understanding of power. Whoever controlled resources controlled the future. Today, water has taken oil's place in that equation. Canada's refusal to open its rivers marked more than a political stance. It was a declaration that water is not just a necessity, but a form of sovereignty, leverage, and strength. Prime Minister Carney's blunt message that Canada's freshwater was not for sale signaled to the world that this resource would not be treated like lumber or steel. It was different. It was existential. And that line in the sand forced other nations to rethink how they viewed both Canada and water itself. Allies began recalibrating their strategies almost immediately. European leaders who once treated Canada as a reliable but quiet partner suddenly viewed it as a potential cornerstone of their survival strategies. In Asia, governments already locked in tense battles over river flows took note of Ottawa's boldness, wondering if they too could transform water into a tool of power rather than vulnerability. Even Washington's closest allies, countries that had long depended on the U.S. to lead in times of crisis, quietly began asking themselves whether Canada, not America, might hold the upper hand in the decades ahead. Rivals, too, adjusted their calculations. For Beijing, Canada's stand was a warning as much as an opportunity. If water could be withheld from the United States, it could just as easily be withheld from others. That meant investment and influence in Ottawa would be more critical than ever. For Russia, which controls vast reserves of its own, the moment reinforced the idea that resource sovereignty could be used to sway global politics. The lesson was unmistakable. Just as oil once rewrote the global order, water was now poised to do the same. Canada had proven that by defending its rivers, it wasn't just protecting sovereignty, it was reshaping the map of power itself. The rest of the world was listening carefully, adjusting their alliances and preparing for a century where the flow of rivers might matter more than the flow of oil pipelines. By the end of the standoff, one reality had become impossible to ignore. Canada was no longer just a quiet neighbor. It had become a global water gatekeeper. With one refusal, Ottawa had shown that control over rivers and lakes could carry as much weight in international politics as oil reserves once did. Around the world, governments, investors, and corporations were recalculating their strategies, all with a single fact in mind. Canada held something everyone else desperately needed. Freshwater wasn't simply a natural gift. It was power, leverage, and influence on a scale few had fully recognized before. For the United States, the implications were sobering. The nation's western states were already staring down forecasts of unrelenting drought stretching far into the future. Reservoirs like Lake Mead and Lake Powell continued to sink, farmland cracked under the sun, and booming cities wrestled with the math of shrinking supplies. Without Canadian cooperation, the U.S. would have no northern lifeline to lean on. Instead, it would be forced to turn inward, pouring billions into desalination plants, costly conservation programs, and technological fixes that might not arrive quickly enough. Even if they did, those solutions carried staggering economic costs that households, industries, and taxpayers would all feel. Meanwhile, Canada's refusal resonated far beyond North America. European leaders began drafting contingency plans built around Canadian exports, while Asian powers like China eyed Ottawa as a critical player in their long-term survival. Markets responded in kind, treating water as a strategic factor in risk assessments alongside energy and security. For Canada, the transformation was swift, from resource supplier to global gatekeeper, holding a card that others could not ignore. For the first time in generations, a smaller country had used restraint, not abundance, to command attention from the world's strongest powers. And yet, this shift carried its own uncertainties. Would Canada be able to withstand the pressure that came with being a water superpower? Would allies turn into rivals once scarcity grew sharper? And how long before another American leader, facing desperate voters and failing reservoirs, tried again to reach across the border, this time with even more forceful demands? The standoff between Trump and Carney may one day be remembered not just as a clash over sovereignty, but as the moment when the world realized water was no longer guaranteed. In the 20th century, oil defined power. In the 21st, it may be rivers, lakes, and reservoirs that decide the fate of nations. And that leaves us with one haunting question. If water is the currency of survival, who truly controls the future? Before you go, I want to hear your take. Do you think water will truly replace oil as the world's most powerful resource? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I'll be reading them all. If you missed our last video, make sure to check it out next. It connects perfectly with what we covered today. And if you value the effort we put into creating these deep dive stories, support us with a quick subscribe. It's just one click, but it means the world to us.